Good morning. May I ask you to take your seats? We are going to start. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, today is an important date for all of us. 1st July, the date of entry into force of the Rome Statute. 20 years ago, in 2002, the first ICC staff members entered the temporary premises of the ICC in Voorburg, a neighborhood here in The Hague. The ratification of the first 60 state parties happened actually quicker than expected, and while there was a lot of expectation among some groups, there was not much attention on the media. Only some newspapers reported on that crucial moment. Soon, with the support of a small group of highly committed staff members, the first 18 judges took office. Later, the first prosecutor started to work. The first meeting of the board of the trust fund was held. The courtroom was built. The first trial of Thomas Lubanga was conducted. We moved to the permanent premises, etc., 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 until we arrive to the date of today. More than 1,000 staff members, 17 ongoing investigations, 31 cases, 7 country offices, and 14 suspects at large. Today, altogether, academia, civil society, experts from international organizations and tribunals, bar associations, representatives of states, we all are going to reflect on the past, on the present, and on the future of the ICC. We have a whole day ahead. After the welcoming remarks of the current ICC president, the conference will open with a keynote speech by the chair of the Rome Conference and first ICC president, His Excellency Mr. Philip Kirsch, followed by 3 substantive panels on various aspects of the court's work. Each session will include the possibility for the audience to ask questions. The conference can be followed live on the ICC YouTube channel in English, French, and Spanish, as well as on the ICC Facebook Live. Here you can follow the debates, the discussions through the headphones. In channel 1 we have English, channel 2 you can follow everything in French, and channel 3 is for Spanish. And for those who speak all languages, you can use channel 0. And without more delay, I want to invite the President of the International Criminal Court, Judge Piotr Hofmanski. Mr. President.
Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the conference International Criminal Court 20, Reflection, the Past, Present, and Future. Thank you for being here in such great number, even if the middle of the summer. Whether you are the legal practitioner, a diplomat, an academic, or representative of civil society, your presence is greatly appreciated. I also send my warm greetings to all those watching the conference online. Thank you for your interest. I hope be an engaging day for everyone. Before I continue, allow me to thank the European Commission for its generous financial support, which made the conference possible. I am also grateful to the municipality of The Hague and the Embassy of France for supporting the event financially. Ladies and gentlemen, exactly 20 years ago, the Rome Statute, the founding treaty of the ICC, entered into force. That day marked the beginning of the ICC's jurisdiction, and it made it possible for the court to be officially set up and gradually start commencing its operations. That is why we celebrate the 1st of July at the ICC's birthday and therefore the court's 20th anniversary today. The ICC has become an incredibly long way in these 20 years. Just a few numbers tell you what I mean. The court has opened investigation in 17 situations concerning conflicts on alleged crimes on 4 different continents. 5 cases are on trial this year, more than ever before. The Trust Fund for Victims has provided assistance and reparations to hundreds and thousands of victims and its family members. The ICC jurisprudence has broken new ground on matters such as use of child soldier, destruction of cultural heritage, and the participation of victims in the judicial proceedings. Global awareness about the ICCs is higher than ever, and the court has beyond any doubt become one of the pillars of the international legal system. Majority of the world's states has joined the system, and numerous countries have criminalized atrocity crimes using the Rome Statute as a model for national legislation. In sum, I'd say that ICC has achieved more in this relatively short time that many thought possible. Sadly, there is no end in sight for the ICC's work. On the contrary, the prosecutor has his hands full with investigations. Judges are sitting in trials and in deliberation day in, day out. The registry is working hard to support all aspects of the court's daily operations, both there in The Hague, as well as the many countries where victims reside. Difference Council and victims' lawyers are equally making crucial contribution to the court's mandate. It is exceptionally busy year. Today's conference offers us a brief moment to stop and to reflect on the path of the ICC has traveled so far. As you will have seen from the program, there is not a ceremonial event. Rather, we chose to use the opportunity to create a space for substantive discussion. We felt that the best way to celebrate the court's 20 years in the fight against impunity was to drill into the ins and outs of what the ICC really does. And we did not want the court to dominate the stage or to have speaker after the speaker show a prize in the ICC. Instead, we invited leading scholars, lawyers, and civil society leaders to provide their honest, critical insight on key aspects of the court's work. As we reflect on the past and the present, we must be prepared to learn lessons learned for the future. On that note, I am truly delighted to announce that after the conference, a conference publication will be prepared for publication in the Inhofe Law Specialist series of Brill publishers, which his name is certainly known to everyone who has ever studied international law. I am very grateful that Professor Kartenstan, who acts as today's reporter, has agreed to edit this volume, which we hope to make a valuable contribution to a critical discourse about the ICC. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a few words about the structure of the conference. We have three exciting sessions on the agenda. Session 1 focuses on the first phase of the ICC case lifespan, from the reports of crimes to the analysis of information by the ICC prosecutor, and further on to investigation where that is warranted. The session will also look at where the prosecutor's actions come under the judicial control in the form of decisions by pre-trial chamber, authorizing investigations or confirming charges against suspects. Session 2. After lunch, we'll then look at the following stages of the ICC case, the ones that happens largely in the courtroom, trials and appeals, and beyond the courtroom in the form of reparations to victims. Cooperation and impact on victims will also be discussed. Finally, session 3 will take a more holistic look at the ICC system, discussing the court's place in the evolving landscape of international criminal justice, the quest for universal ratification of the Rome Statute, the crucial role of civil society, and prospects for the statute's expansion in the future. In all these sessions, the floor will be opened to questions from the audience after the presentation of the panelists. But before we go to any of the three panels, I'm thrilled to present today's keynote speaker. We are very privileged to have with us Mr. Philipp Kirsch, the first president of the International Criminal Court from 2003 to 2009, when he also served as a judge of the court's appeal chamber. As such, he played a key role in the institution building phase of the International Criminal Court. But as most of you would know, Mr. Kirsch's role in the ICC's genesis goes far beyond that. He chaired the committee of the whole of the Rome Conference of 1998, where the ICC's statute was famously adopted, and the very last night on the 5-week negotiations. He subsequently chaired the preparatory commission for the ICC until the statute's entry into force. I heartily request stating that Mr. Kirsch is uniquely placed to cast light on the ICC's birth and early development. As such, I am truly grateful that he accepted the invitation to address us today. And I believe I share the sentiment of the audience when I say that I really look forward to hearing his remarks. Mr. Kirsch, may I invite you to the stage and to take the floor.
Mr. President, I first of all wish to thank you for your very kind invitation to be here today. I'm very honored by this invitation, and I'm also very pleased to see in the room so many friends, colleagues I haven't seen for a very long time, some of whom indeed shared experiences in the Rome Conference and beyond that you referred to. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, for anything major to happen in international law, new institutions, new mechanisms, new rules, you need a special set of circumstances. One factor is recognition by states of a need which is often brought to light by a major crisis. Another is an element of pressure which comes from states, media, and civil society. Yet another is a degree of harmony in interstate relations that is necessary to avoid blockage. The creation of the ICC was no exception. The 1998 Rome Conference took place in an environment where the need to repress major crimes was recognized. The tragic events that took place in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda were on everybody's mind. The spread of information about those crimes were unprecedented. It was also recognized that something more was needed than an ever-expanding series of ad hoc tribunals. But also at the time, a period of cooperation among states, including powerful states, had started. It did not last long, but it existed for a few years. I have vivid memories of the achievements that period of collaboration made possible, well before the ICC, as a Canadian diplomat working in the UN environment. Long-standing problems could suddenly be resolved. An international criminal court of some kind had been contemplated long before. I won't go into that history that you know well. The creation of a court was deferred time and again under legal pretexts that covered the real reason. It could not be established in a world that was subsumed in rival political blocs. But in the 1990s, support for the creation of the court became irresistible. Even states that, to say the least, lacked enthusiasm knew that. Not being able to stop its creation, they rather turned to what they saw as a damage limitation exercise. Before turning to the Rome Conference, I would like to make a brief comment which underlies the rest of my presentation. As I mentioned, a fundamental reason for creating the ICC was to stop creating ad hoc tribunals à la pièce. It would be much more practical and sensible to have one single institution able to deal with crimes committed in the future, regardless of time and place. But that sensible goal was also the major problem of the future court. The jurisdiction of the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals, the Security Council, ad hoc tribunals, and others was strictly circumscribed, while, in fact, within certain parameters, all knew and agreed who should be tried. By contrast, the ICC jurisdiction was unpredictable. The Rome Conference never promised the ICC a rose garden. In fact, the conference ensured that there would be no rose garden by multiplying what could be variably called safeguards or obstacles in the court's operations. The statute of the Tribunal for former Yugoslavia has 30 articles. The ICC is about 130, including an exceptionally difficult amendment procedure. Contrary to other tribunals, where the rules of procedure were consistently left to the judges, states insisted on drafting the ICC rules themselves. Why all that? Partly for sound reasons, to ensure fairness of the proceedings, but also because states wanted to make sure that the court's unpredictable exercise of jurisdiction would be compensated by extraordinary predictability in its functioning. I often ask myself whether it would have been possible to design a system that would be lighter, less encumbered. In terms of adoption in Rome, it would not have been so difficult. It would have been just a matter of calling for votes on specific issues. Majorities at the time were guaranteed for a court enjoying considerable independence. But there would have been a high price to pay. A great court on paper, without the necessary practical, balanced support provided by different states to ensure a successful future to the court. That is why, facing a negotiating process that was paralyzed on some fundamental issues, a package eventually was presented that was deemed to represent an acceptable balance. And yet, a vote could not be avoided in Rome. There were requests for more steps, restricting the independence of the court or tightening its jurisdiction. But then it was the view of those managing the conference that to accede to those requests would jeopardize the core of the system. To give you an example, it was proposed to exempt some individuals from the court's jurisdiction by virtue of their official position, exactly the opposite of what the creation of the court was meant to achieve. Believe me, that was discussed until the last minute under tremendous pressure. The Rome Conference then ended in relative division, enthusiasm for the majority of states, disagreement in other parts. That is why the preparatory commission that took over made sustained efforts from 1999 to 2002 to attract as wide global support for the system as possible. And indeed, consensus was achieved on almost everything, including fundamental instruments such as the rules of procedure and evidence of the court and the elements of crimes. The pace of ratifications, as we know, exceeded expectations, and the requisite number of 60 states joining the system was surprisingly fast in less than 4 years. A few words now on the first years of the court. Those were largely devoted to institution building, the construction of a solid legal and administrative framework. There's no need to get into details, but it was done as efficiently as possible before investigations and judicial work picked up speed. At the time, judicial work, even at its peak, did not, of course, compare to the massive workload the work is managing today. But judges had a lot to learn and understand, including novel elements of the statute. For example, for those first years, the participation of victims in proceedings, one of the major achievements of the Rome Statute, was the subject of about half the interlocutory appeals, the rest being largely devoted to admissibility of evidence. Administration had its own challenges. As we were discussing earlier with my friend Luis Moreno Ocampo, discussions in the Courts Coordination Council, I will not hide from you, the council consisting of the principals of the court, were rather animated. The court today, as I'm told, lives in internal harmony. But it took a while, in the first few years, to understand that to achieve the court's mission, its organs needed to cooperate fully, that overlapping mandates inherent in the Rome Statute needed to be managed together without competing. I'm tempted to give examples, but I won't. What I will say, though, is this. Of course, the Rome Statute provides for some organs of the court an independence that needs to be fully respected. That is an essential part of the exercise of different judicial responsibilities. But that independence should not be synonymous with insufficient inter-organ communications. The court is more than the sum of its parts. It cannot be fully functional if it is composed of silos living in splendid isolation. Institutional building then in those years, yes, but not only. The court had to find its place on the international plane and build support. That first took the form of formal agreements with the United Nations, the host state, and a large number of other agreements that were necessary for its operations. That period also required extensive outreach to make the court better known and, above all, better understood by states and international organizations. It is no secret that at the beginning of its existence, the court faced strong opposition. That was largely due to domestic political reasons, but also to a stated apprehension that the court might behave as a political organ. The duty of the court, of course, was to respect its judicial mandate strictly. It did so, opposition softened, and cooperation developed. That said, it is fair to recognize that the difficulties experienced by the court in its external relations at the time pale in comparison to those that it faced later. An important reason for this is that the first situations were generated by states on their own situation or by the Security Council, while later, states that in principle supported the court fully began to find flaws with it when they found themselves subject to investigations they had not initiated or simply did not like the direction other investigations were taking. That is in the nature of the beast. The court is bound to affect important political and economic interests. It will always generate tensions and criticisms that are not terribly fair or accurate. That is not to say that the ICC has not made or does not make mistakes. It does benefit from oversight and recommendations. Improvements can be made in the judicial, prosecutorial, and administrative areas of the ICC's activities. I note, for example, that the court is responding positively to the recent independent expert review. But those are recent recommendations aimed at achieving improvements, not attacks for political reasons. Excellences.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, so far I have been talking about events that I witnessed. In this last part, I would like to talk about certain more topical issues. But in light of the fact that I left the court a long time ago, these are reflections primarily intended to give you food for thought. A word on cooperation, which is an indispensable component of the ICC system. In the vast majority of cases, the states are willing to cooperate with the court in good faith. Unfortunately, a mere majority is simply not enough. The lack of cooperation with respect to the arrest of suspects or access to key evidence has hampered the court's effectiveness. That, in and by itself, is not a surprise. Opposition was to be expected. Many states welcomed the idea of a court that would target others, overlooking the possibility that their own nationals and even their own leaders could become persons of interest. This is, of course, rather unfortunate, but what is more disappointing is what happens next, or what does not happen. When the court was created, it was expected that states parties would challenge those states that did not comply with its regulations. Institutionally, at least, that did not happen. The Assembly of States Parties, so far, which has the statutory obligation to deal with matters related to non-cooperation, has been systematically prevented from providing robust responses in cases of non-compliance with the rules of the court and against political attacks. The concern to maintain smooth relations among states and to avoid rocking the boat has trumped the objective of demanding compliance, a requirement and vital importance. There are, of course, reasons for this, but that is not how the system is supposed to work, a fact that certainly does not escape the attention of those who are unwilling to cooperate with the court or who seek to attack the court. On a related point, the relative stagnation in the total number of states parties is regrettable, as are indeed the withdrawals that have taken place. That reflects the current state of the rule of law at the international level, as well as the putting to the test of multilateralism and other factors that are external to the court. I look forward to the discussions in session 3 of this conference on expanding the global reach of the court and the challenging circumstances. The second topic that I would like to touch upon the ICC's workload is the ICC's workload and the related issue of complementarity. At the Rome conference, focus was on getting the adoption of a treaty and the creation of an institution based on sound principles. I do not think that anyone fully understood at the time the large scope of the challenges that the court is facing with 17 open situations, investigations, and cases on different continents with infinite variations. There is obvious tension between that growing workload and the resources available to the court. The ICC may prioritize its list of situations, but there is no inbuilt escape valve in the system that would dissipate that tension. That brings us back to the basics, the principle pursuant to which international crimes must be dealt with in national courts, the ICC being solely a court of last resort. 20 years after the creation of the court, there are still gaps in the national legislations, including in key principles. Political will and commitment to accountability is another key but extremely crucial factor. Much like with cooperation, the conduct of certain states affects the actions of other states positively or negatively. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, could the ICC have been created today? There is no doubt that the need for the court is more real than ever. Allegations of crimes under the Rome Statute are staggering, including in forms that we all believed or hoped belonged to the past. The contempt that is shown for the most basic rules of international humanitarian law, and indeed generally for human life, is deeply shocking. It is equally clear in this context that some national systems are simply unwilling or unable to ensure the repression of crimes, and some of them themselves are involved in those crimes. So the need is there. But the world has changed. Interstate relations are no longer what they used to be. The world today is more divided, more fragmented than it was in the 1990s. That is, in fact, an excellent reason, as we mark the 20th anniversary of the entry into force of the Rome Statute, to celebrate the fact that the ICC was created when it was possible and in a way that allowed the vast majority of states to integrate the system. Today, the ICC is alive and shall not disappear. It must continue to do its work diligently and effectively despite the resistance, and to demonstrate that the system is functional. We will see where that takes us in the next few years. I am truly delighted that this conference is taking place today. 13 years after leaving the court, I am certain I will be greatly enlightened by the discussions in this forum.
On a note which is unrelated to this conference. The 1st of July is the anniversary of the entry into force of the Rome Statute, but it is not the only anniversary. I wish to wish an excellent, happy Canada Day to all Canadians today. Thank you.
So after these remarks of the first president and the current president of the ICC, we are starting the first session. From the crimes to the courtroom, preliminary examinations, investigations, and confirmation of charges. And I would like to invite the panelists to take their places here on the stage. The panelists are the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, His Excellency Karim, the President of the Kosovo Specialist Chambers, Judge Ekatarina Trendafilova, Professor Daryl Robinson, Priya Gopalan, and Professor Olympia Beku. And the chair of this panel is Mrs. Angela Mudukuti, currently Senior Legal Advisor at the Global Justice Centers. Mrs. Mudukuti is a Zimbabwean human rights lawyer specialized in international criminal law. She has worked for a number of organizations, including the International Criminal Court, focusing on strategic litigation, advocacy, and capacity building. Her work experience includes training prosecutors and investigators to enhance domestic capacity to tackle international crimes, working on universal jurisdiction and precedent-setting cases before South African courts. She has written and published on international criminal law issues in books, journals, and newspapers, and she sits on a number of editorial committees. Mrs. Mudukuti, the floor is yours.
Welcome, distinguished guests, members of civil society and academia, and to all of you watching at home. Thank you for joining us today on this very important occasion. As introduced, I am Angela Mudukuti, and it is indeed a pleasure to be with you today as we reflect on the past, think about the present, and plan for the future. Many impactful things happened 20 years ago. The Milosevic trial began. The FIFA Men's World Cup was hosted jointly by South Korea and Japan. It was the first time it was not held in Europe or the Americas. The Organization for African Unity became the African Union. Halle Berry was the first African-American woman to win an Oscar for Best Actress. And we were all probably still mesmerized by our yellow Nokia cell phones at the time. But most importantly, the ICC was born. A moment many thought would never come to pass, but here we are, 20 years later. Like many of us in the room, having worked in and outside of the court over the last 13 years, I'm a friend of the court. I'm a constructive critic when necessary, and most of all, I am a believer in the court's mandate and mission. This first panel, from crimes to the courtroom, preliminary examinations, investigations, and confirmation of charges, is a perfect way to start today's conference because this is where it all truly begins. Preliminary examinations and investigations play a key role in how the ICC is perceived. Where do you open preliminary examinations? When and which ones turn into investigations? How are these investigations conducted? Is it one-sided? Who gets charged and why, and for which crimes? And what about judicial control of investigations and charging, which is something Judge Ekatarina Trendafilova will shed light on this morning? The answer to all of these questions has shaped and will continue to shape perceptions and assessments of the ICC. Over the past 20 years, the court has been criticized for being too slow, only investigating one side of the conflict, shying away from investigating powerful states, failing to adequately address sexual and gender-based violence, bringing the wrong charges. The list goes on and on. And whatever your opinion on these issues, I think we can all agree that the last 20 years have not been perfect. The independent expert review devoted a substantial portion of its report to preliminary examinations and investigations. They tackled the issue of resources, the fact that the court has a caseload that far exceeds its capacity. They analyzed the office approach to preliminary examinations, including the selection of situations, which is something we have Professor Daryl on hand to discuss today. They addressed the lack of timelines, lack of benchmarks. When it came to investigations, they looked at issues of prioritization, hibernation, and the closure of cases. In short, the experts and many of us in this room agree that the OTP needs to be more effective and more efficient. It's one thing to criticize the OTP, but one cannot do that without looking at states as well. Because linked to all of this is the issue of state cooperation. Whether we're talking about budget, providing adequate resources so the court can do its work, or access to victims and witnesses, or other forms of cooperation, having national implementing legislation, which is something Professor Olympia Beku will talk to us about today. The fact is, states need to support the court. States need to support the Office of the Prosecutor and all its work, not just the cases they like or the cases that align with their political agenda. States need to do better. However, it is not all doom and gloom, and there have been significant improvements and many achievements that the court should be proud of. As mentioned by the President, important precedents have been set. Thousands have been assisted via reparations. We've seen an improved engagement with sexual and gender-based crimes, a topic we have Ms. Priya Gopalan on hand with today to talk to us about, including intersectionality. We see a more geographically diverse docket, and we've seen brave, justice-centered decisions made in the face of staunch political opposition and sanctions. Ladies and gentlemen, the truth is there is much work to be done. Under new leadership, change is underway. We've seen more constructive engagement with the IER recommendations. We've seen a willingness to listen and engage with all stakeholders, including civil society. We've seen a recognition of the need to be more efficient, including making use of modern technology, which is something the prosecutor will cover this morning. It will take time, and I hope the necessary changes will continue to be made for a more efficient and effective ICC. And so this morning we have a very impressive collection of speakers. I could not be more pleased to be chairing this session, and I very much look forward to their contributions today. And before I hand over to our esteemed speakers, I'd like to remind them to speak slowly for the purposes of interpretation. And I also have very strict instructions to make sure you stay within your allotted 12 minutes so we can have enough time for audience participation. So forgive me if I have to ask you to wrap up, and thank you in advance for not making that necessary. With that, I'd like to begin by introducing our first speaker, Prosecutor Karim Khan. He has extensive experience as a prosecutor, victims counsel, and defense lawyer in a wide variety of courts, including the ICC, the ICTY, the ICTR, the Extraordinary Chambers of Cambodia, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, and the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And before taking up his position as the ICC prosecutor in June last year, he served as the head of UNITAD. Very good to have you here. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. Mindful of the 12 minutes, I think I'll stay seated rather than stand, so I save a bit of time. But really, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real honor to participate in this event. Judge Kirsch to me, a great honor that you also addressed us with the other wonderful founders, architects and builders, because that's what everybody that has played a role or plays a role in the Rome Statute is. We're servants, but many of you have been those architects and those builders, and we are at a point when there's massive strain on the building, on the foundations, and we need to renovate and we need to become stronger and more effective. I think as we're sitting here today, we also have to start by recalling that throughout the world in refugee camps, in different situations, people look to this court. They look to what it represents, what you've all built, with real hope, not because of a celebration on an anniversary, but because of the misery of their lives. And it's that keen sense of responsibility, that acute awareness of the expectations and the difficulties that brings on an institution that is human and that has a legal regime that Judge Philip Kirsch identified that was a result of compromises, that is imperfect, that we have to somehow improve. Now, in this session, there's going to be a lot of discussions from the very eminent panelists on wonderfully interesting areas, prioritization, issues of processes. But I decided quite deliberately to focus on something that seems to be much more mundane, maybe even boring. But it all comes back to evidence. And the use of technology is an absolutely essential aspect, in my view, to separate the wheat from the chaff, to get and identify the best evidence, the most reliable evidence, either incriminating in nature or exonerating. And that's one of the key aspects and one of the secret gifts of the Rome Statute, the civil law concept enshrined in Article 54. So in this period of looking back, it is a wonderful opportunity to look forward. And I think that is what I hope to do. I see that if you can just let me know when I've got 30 seconds to go, and I will try to wrap up. Because I'll have to be told, I know myself at least that much. When one looks at on television screens, when you look at the phone, when you look at the yellow Nokia that was mentioned, and you look at the smartphones and the massive computing power, we see very obviously the world is very different to the world that was in Rome in 2002. The evidence that was relevant in the Balkans is quite different from the massive data sets available today. In the ICTY, in the ICTR, when we talked about video or evidence or non-testimonial evidence, largely it was from journalists that had filmed on old films. I think Digital was not even there at the moment. And then, of course, there was documents, there was archives, and so on and so forth. And when we look now, it's a completely different world. An example became really apparent in my last mandate that was alluded to. Within a year of becoming operational, we had collected in UNITAD, the United Nations team investigating ISIS, relevant video evidence that would have taken somebody a whole year working 24 hours a day to review. And that will therefore lead to either two options or three options. Don't collect it. Collect it and don't know what it is. Or simply, get drowned and think, how on earth do we deal with this? technology is absolutely key. When you look at phones, when we look at modern conflicts, individuals, people in the streets, how they're documenting, how they're videoing, it's absolutely an essential data set. When we look at witness evidence even, in order to triangulate where people could have been, unlocking phones, looking at cell masts, and looking at cell site evidence is absolutely essential. And really, in my view, this is absolutely critical if we're to move forward, looking at the dark web and the internet. So we can't do this by analog means in a digital world. And we certainly can't, in my view, take the law to the front line unless we are equipped to do so. It's a matter of negligence if soldiers are sent in without PPE and necessary equipment, and we can't be expected to fulfill a very difficult mandate to collect evidence that is available with a pen and a quill and a piece of paper. We have to get up with the times. And I've said this repeatedly. I said it before I was elected. I made it clear that a paradigm shift was necessary in the last Assembly of State Parties budget, and technology was a key. And I think we're really quite extraordinarily lucky to have the registrar we have, because already in the last few months, the court's made massive commitments, and of course the President, to move to the cloud. This is the basic platform of the 21st century for evidence gathering. We have to use new e-discovery techniques, use issues in an integrated way, whether it's relativity and moving forward. And I think already in the last 2 months, we've made quite significant changes in the Office of the Prosecutor. Of course, I put forward a note verbal because I have a fundamental obligation, which I don't apologize for, to do my best for all the failings that I'll make and the office will make, to make the office more vibrant, more effective than it was before. And we've tried the begging bowl approach in the Assembly of State Parties, but we need the tools to do the job. And the influx of money that has come more recently to be used across situations and to stand up and do better has already been put to good use. By next month, by the end of next month, hopefully we will have a new system in place, because we've partnered with Microsoft Tech for Social Impact Group. And basically this is a secure means of victims and witnesses and others sending information to the office in a very secure manner. And we're not going to be selfish about it. We're also going to work with other partners so that we can receive information safely and securely, and then use technology to organize it, ingest it, and then see what it means. Big data analysis is clearly the task that we have. Judges can't make the best decisions unless we present the best evidence. And of course, some of this will have implications to disclosure, how we are organizing evidence, how we are working with the defense. And I met Jennifer Nowry, the president of the ICCBA, last week, and we want to also have discussions with the defense. But if we collect more, we can hopefully identify that evidence and move it to the judges. By the end of the year, I'm hoping with this partnership, with these tools, the cloud, relativity, e-discovery, to also move to use some of the cognitive services that are available. I've met the president of Microsoft, Brad Smith. We've been partnering with them very closely. And in my last mandate, I saw that when you combine, not as isolated platforms, but in an integrated way, machine translation, when you can do voice-to-text transcription, so you can get a video and put artificial intelligence and algorithms to work and take the voice and put it into text, and then have also translation services, one can do more with the tools that we have. We can move faster with the tools that we have. And then once that's transcribed, we can search it. And again, that will help us, hopefully, we will see, find the proverbial needle in the haystack, find the relevant evidence that either is relevant and probative to a fact and issue that's incriminating, or will help us from making mistakes in having theories that are on shaky foundations. Facial recognition, voice identification are not, from the dim and distant past. We've used them, they work, and then it allows us to use human intelligence, the actual wonderful staff that we have, to check and to verify, to make sure that we have the best evidence, the most reliable evidence that we can present to judges, who will then assess it after it's been tested by the parties. The opportunity also is there to bring the crime scene to the courtroom. We've done that. The areas we're operating in are difficult, they're challenging. Even if judges do crime scene visits, it's always useful to reorientate oneself or reorientate a witness. Now, we've seen snapshots of this even in the Al-Mahdi case, when the software and the package prepared by Situ Research was put before the judges, and many such examples can be used that will actually help judges and the parties, and then the victims and the witnesses, see the crime scene, understand what happened, and make probably, we hope, ever better decisions and more quickly. I think this is also not some development or technology for the sake of it. It's not change for the sake of change. It's a way of holding the hand and building bridges and forging ever better links of relevance with national authorities. We can't be seen to be this isolated court on the dunes of the Hague. We have to be looking at new ways of showing the relevance, not just in terms of the normative principles, but the actual evidence that we get. And I think this leads to what I've described as the office of the prosecutor being not and the court, in fact, with respect, not being an apex court, but being a hub. We can share evidence with national authorities using the technology so that every national authority that has universal jurisdiction or has other criminal jurisdiction can benefit from what they're paying for, hopefully reliable evidence that could feed into their domestic cases. Because if we think this court can by itself counter impunity and make it extinct, we have to be a little bit more humble, I think, and realize we're all in this together. Every national authority needs to work and be supported, because only then, with this common front of legality, will we have a chance to move forward in a better way. So this requires a paradigm shift. I think I've been told one more minute. I think if we can work in this manner of partnership, of building bridges, of showing the relevance of the work of the court, if we can have the impact that victims deserve, work with a greater pace, which is extremely difficult. I know how difficult it is for judges with so few resources of legal officers, how difficult it is for the registry, for all of the work they do, witness protection and travel and all the rest of it. But if we work in this collegiate manner, using technology, presenting evidence more effectively, obtaining evidence from disparate sources, not only will we reduce the burden of relying upon testimonial evidence, not only will we make it easier for victims and witnesses who sometimes feel it's all down to us when we're tested. We have other sources of information. I think the court will become ever more relevant. Hopefully states will support it ever more, and we can move forward. So my last word really has to be that for all the wonderful work that's been done, for all the debt we owe to those that have served the court, we must believe that the best days of the court are ahead of us, because that's the only hope, indeed that's the only prayer, if the worst days of humanity are finally to be behind us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prosecutor. Our next speaker is Judge Ekatarina Trendafilova. She has been the president of the Kosovo Specialist Chambers since January 2017. Before that, she served for 9 years as a judge at the ICC, including as president of the pretrial division. She's also a renowned scholar in the field of criminal procedure, human rights, international and comparative criminal justice. In her native Bulgaria, Judge Trendafilova advised the country's Ministry of Justice on the establishment of the ICC and served in many other professional capacities that are too numerous to name here. Wonderful to see you again. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Angela. I prefer to stand before you. Of course, the event is so special, but not only because of the event. The chair is quite high, and I feel quite uncomfortable there. So I thank very much President Hofmanski for having invited me to this very, very important event, the 20th anniversary of the entry into force of the Rome Statute. I really feel very, very honored and privileged to be here today as one of the first judges elected to the ICC, to whose success I, as all my colleagues, am also passionately committed. As President Kirsch also said, it's such a nice feeling to see so many famous faces, which bring wonderful memories of the time that we spent together, working hard, having some nice times as well, disputing a lot, sometimes becoming even confrontational, but for the sole reason to make our genuine contribution to the mandate of the ICC and to its good future. So that's why I thank again for the invitation, and I'm very happy to see the first president of the court. I always address him, President Kirsch, for everything that he has done throughout his tenure. I'm invited to speak today about the judicial control of investigations and charging. The topic requires an understanding of the delicate relationship between the prosecuting authority and the judiciary, and the need to maintain proper balance and that preserves the independence of the prosecutor without, however, compromising the judicial scrutiny needed to safeguard values protected by the rule of law. Historically, prosecutors' decisions were not subject to judicial review. Over time, different forms of judicial control gradually emerged, subject to the concept eloquently described by the prominent Federalist James Madison, who in the Federalist Papers, published for the first time on the 1st of May 1788, stated, "No man is allowed to be a judge in his own cause." To date, judicial control is an inimitable element of international standards and an inherent component of democratic legal systems where the rule of law, human rights, and fairness are upheld and cherished. Thus, it is not a surprise that judicial control is deeply rooted in the legal framework of the International Criminal Court, which incorporates and further develops best approaches and high standards in the field of criminal justice. Judicial control within the Rome Statute is predominantly apparent at the pretrial stage, where the prosecutor is the dominus litis, with different powers and responsibilities entrusted on him, which serve the purpose of the investigation and the building up of cases for adjudication. In this context, the Rome Statute provides for various modalities of judicial control dependent on the nature of the matter under consideration. Well, in some instances, the wording of the law is clear and unambiguous. Other provisions or areas remain surrounded by what is known as constructive ambiguity, a term used by Henry Kissinger, who endorsed this tactic when negotiating sensitive topics. An opposite example in this respect may be discerned in the context of preliminary examination of the Office of the Prosecutor. I recall one instance in the early days of the court's operation, which triggered a kind of a judicial control in the situation in the Central African Republic, which was referred to the court by the government of the country. The prosecutor spent almost 2 years before deciding whether to open or not an investigation. The government complained to the pretrial chamber and was asking to receive some information about the prosecutor's intention whether to proceed or not with the investigation. And although the legal framework does not explicitly speak of judicial control in this context, the judges felt the urge to request information, only information from the prosecutor, thus exercising a sort of a control in order to ensure, to the extent possible, the transparent functioning of the court. The judges' approach is a reminiscence of early famous English case from the 1940s, Seaford Court Estates Limited versus Escher, reflecting Lord Denning's view on judicial creativity. Lord Denning noted that where a legal document lacks, and I quote, divine precision and perfect clarity, a judge, rather than, again quoting, simply folding hands and blaming the draftsman, must set to work on the constructive task of finding the drafter's intention, not only in light of the clear wording of the law, but also in light of the social conditions which gave rise to it and of the mischief which it was passed to remedy. This perception portrays what the pretrial chamber did. Instead of folding their hands and blaming the drafters, the judges relied on judicial creativity and requested the prosecutor to provide information on the current status of the preliminary examination and an estimate of when a decision to investigate or not will be taken. Importantly, the judge's decision by asking only information did not compromise the independence of the prosecutor's assessment of the reasonable basis to proceed or not with the investigation. The independence remained intact. In the years to follow, the pretrial chambers favored a much more reserved approach, and currently, judicial control over preliminary examinations is very limited, if at all existing. And I will give as an example a decision of the pretrial chamber recently rejecting in limine the request of the government of Venezuela to intervene in the protracted preliminary examination of its situation. This request, however, was different because the government was requiring that PTC engages in the preliminary examination of the prosecutor with substantial questions as suggested by the government. In contrast to preliminary examinations, there is no need to rely on any kind of judicial creativity when it comes to the prosecutor's decision to proprio motu initiate an investigation. By virtue of the law, judicial oversight in this scenario is imperative. I can point to the situations in Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, Georgia, Burundi, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and recently the Philippines. The rationale behind mandatory judicial review in this context is quite clear: to prevent the court's possible politicization or appearance thereof on account of the prosecutor's possible arbitrary behavior. And this is something that President Kirsch, President Fernandez have been witnessing the big fight that was going on during the Rome conference and prior to that. So I thank them for reaching this very balanced approach to have judicial control only in this context. Practices of the court show that judicial control in investigations and charging has also a direct impact on the scope of investigations and the nature of the cases that follow. In regard to the scope of investigations, we may recall the Burundi and Myanmar situation. In its judgments, the pretrial chamber took a flexible approach by authorizing the prosecutor to extend the investigation over crimes that occurred before and after the temporal scope of the prosecutor's request, if the legal requirements of the contextual elements are fulfilled. Similarly, the pretrial chamber addressed crimes of a continuous nature. The pretrial chamber took the same stance also on the material scope of the investigation. It did not restrict the prosecutor to the incidents and crimes set out in his decision, but granted the prosecutor the opportunity, based on the evidence, to extend the investigation to other crimes as long as they remain within the parameters of the authorized investigation. This approach has its roots, so I'm running out of time, 2 minutes. This approach has its roots in one of the first appeal judgments in the early years of the court in the Lubanga case. The appeals chamber allowed the prosecutor, and I quote, to continue his investigation in respect of crimes that are not covered by the document containing the charges and beyond the confirmation hearing if this is necessary in order to establish the truth. Relatively recent jurisprudence of the appeals chamber introduced limitations to the scope and intensity of the judicial control. Here I refer to the 20th March 2020 judgment concerning the situation in Afghanistan that was thereafter followed in the decision related to the Philippines situation. There are other forms of judicial control, and I will try to finish just in a minute, where the pretrial chamber exercises judicial control only when the prosecutor, when there is a referral of a state party or of a security council, decides not to proceed. And here I just want to refer to one very important decision that was taken in the Comoros situation, where the pretrial chamber conducted 3 rounds of review, albeit in different compositions of the chamber, between January 2015 and September 2020. And here what deserves to be pointed out is that the prosecutor did not comply with the decision of the pretrial chamber. I think that Judge Tarforser was sitting on this first composition taking this decision. But thereafter, in a different composition of the pretrial chamber decided to impose on the prosecutor to abide by the decision that was taken by the pretrial chamber. This decision has been confirmed by the appeals chamber, and finally, the office of the prosecutor has to comply. I will finish by saying that, of course, there are other instances where judicial control is put in place after the opening of investigation, and I will finish just by referring to warrants of arrest, summonses to appear, unique investigative opportunities, the pretrial detention, disclosure of evidence, and confirmation of charges. So without further on engaging, of course, there is a tendency with former judges of the ICC to take all the time that is allocated to the whole panel, because we used to love what we have been doing. But once again, I would like to congratulate all my colleagues and everyone who is here on the 20th anniversary of the Court of the World, and to wish that the future further on provides strong proof that this was one of the best ideas and best developments in the field of international criminal justice, and we all stand strong by the mandate of the ICC. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Judge. Our next speaker is Professor Daryl Robinson. He is a full professor at Queen's University Faculty of Law in Canada and has worked on international criminal justice for over 25 years, starting as an NGO advocate for a permanent international criminal court. He was involved in the negotiation of the Rome Statute and the adoption of Canada's Crime Against Humanity Act, and he served as an advisor to the ICC Office of the Prosecutor in the early years of the court from 2004 to 2006. He's widely published on international criminal law and is the recipient of several awards and prizes for his work. Good to have you here. You have the floor, Daryl.
Thank you. Oh, there I am. Okay. So my topic is choices in selecting situations and cases. Everyone has opinions about situation and case selection. So I'm not going to go into any of those weeds. Instead, what I want to do is give you a map. I want to try to point out certain patterns and give you a framework that will help you assess this chaos of conflicting views. Okay, conflicting views and recommendations. So some years ago, oh, I hate the echo. Some years ago, I wrote an article about inescapable dyads, which was about paradoxes. In the criticisms, they reveal simultaneous opposite simultaneous opposite requirements. So if we recognize those patterns, we can have a better conversation. A conversation that would be more humble, more open-minded, more respectful, and more productive. So I'll start by giving you examples of what do I mean by these patterns. As one example, the OTP is continuously and simultaneously criticized for reaching too high and too low. Too low means that they're not going after big enough fish, they're too timid, and they're afraid of power. Too high means that they're over-focused on the big fish, they're grandstanding, and they're not doing the manageable cases. The independent expert review criticized the OTP for both simultaneously, which I think shows the contradictory demands that are put on the court. This plays out, by the way, on a bigger scale in situation selection. The ICC is criticized for unfairly pursuing weak countries and at the same time for unfairly pursuing powerful countries. So we're told it's a neo-colonialist tool of the great powers, and at the same time, it's an NGO tool of lawfare against the great powers. And the ICC has suffered real fallout from these opposite criticisms, right, with the sanctions from the US and withdrawals from African states. So here's another selection dilemma for you. Should the prosecutor, when selecting situations or cases, should he consider the possible repercussions of his actions? So impact on a peace process, or humanitarian aid workers might get expelled. Whatever answer you're thinking of right now will be vehemently and plausibly condemned. If you don't take into account the consequences, then you are too imperious. You are disruptive and you're disrespectful of other actors and interests. But if you do take into account repercussions, then you're too deferential, and people say that's inappropriate for a prosecutor to even think of such things. Or here's another one. If a state is rebuilding its justice system, but it needs time, should you give them a chance? Should you give them time? Both answers are wrong, because if you do give them time, there's going to be a strong chorus of voices plausibly condemning you because your preliminary examinations take too long and you should have time limits. But if you don't, then a strong chorus of voices will condemn you for trampling over states in the spirit of complementarity. One of the themes in the IER report was that preliminary examinations are taking too long. So then when the OTP closed, the longest running PE, which was the Colombia situation, did they get praised? No, they were condemned. They were condemned by a strong chorus of voices. So there are no simple answers. All options lead to condemnation. I gave you 3 examples, but I can give you more. These permeate. So what are these patterns in these conversations? So one, I think the problem is there's multiple contradictory goals of the ICC. The root contradiction is that we want the ICC to be real and ideal. Real, grounded in the system, and also above the system at the same time. So any possible policy the ICC could possibly adopt fails on one of these criteria. Number 2, most of the comments, they take what I would call a one-dimensional analysis of a multi-dimensional problem. Each criticism seizes on one goal or value and then finds a shortcoming. Each criticism, viewed on its own, is plausible because they're pointing to a concern that's legitimate. And unfortunately, most people see the concerns in isolation and they don't see this pattern. So we hear constantly that the ICC is failing to X and failing to Y, and it's failing to A and it's failing to B. It's constantly failing. And also, I would say, third, whenever observers try to explain these failures they discover, the answer, watch for this if you, in the next thing you read, the answer they'll give is incompetence or politicization. And what the conversation routinely fails to consider is another explanation. These interconnected, irreconcilable requirements that anyone's brilliant solution X is going to cause new problems that will be condemned by someone else. So how do we get to a better conversation? One, I think we all need to recognize this circle of contradictory requirements. Number two, and this one's going to sound weird, pointing out a problem is not a sufficient critique. And what I mean by that is, if the ICC adopts Rule X, there's going to be a wave of criticisms correctly pointing out that X causes problems A, B, and C. And then people will understandably say, well, why is the ICC doing something that causes problems? You should adopt Rule not X. And that's not a sufficient analysis because Rule X causes problems D, E, and F. And only when we recognize that, then we can have the real conversation, the hard conversation. And this is, we only get to decide what problems to have. And we don't get to decide not to have problems. It's not on our menu. It's all imperfect, right? So we get to intelligently and consciously decide which flaws to have. I love the IER and the work they did, but I think at times they fell into the trap of one-dimensional analysis. So they collected all these criticisms. The court's doing X, they should do not X. But we need to keep going to do a thoughtful analysis to identify the least bad options. So what are the prescriptions for how we think? One, I would suggest the ICC, whenever it adopts policies, should expressly situate it in these contradictory demands and preemptively acknowledge, we know this is imperfect, and here's why we think this is the least bad option. I think the Assembly of States Parties should be having conversations about its contradictory expectations. Just as an example, people want investigations to be fast, cheap, comprehensive, meeting gold standards of evidence, and with limited external support. Right? And we get mad when we don't get all five. It's a five-way contradiction. And I think we have to have a realistic conversation about what is an actually plausible model. So in the remaining 3 minutes, I'll give you two illustrations of how this could have implications for some of the concrete issues we have. Here's one example is feasibility. Should feasibility of investigation and arrest be a consideration in selection? Any answer creates real problems, and so we only get to pick which problem to have. Answer one, yeah, feasibility should matter, because we don't want to be spending time on money on cases and raising hopes of victims and putting witnesses at risk for cases that won't go anywhere. But the problem is if you do that, if feasibility is a consideration, then you're in a way you're giving a free pass to the powerful who have the power to make your investigation non-feasible. So either of those options is flawed. So the solution is probably going to be the soundest options. There are going to be some compromise in between option. Maybe feasibility is to some extent a consideration. But then let's know in advance that in-between solutions are inherently messy and they're unclear and they're going to be criticized for that. Plus, they're going to get criticized on both ends for the problems they create. But that's okay. The discussion should just simply acknowledge, here's the contradictory considerations. Here's how we're going to weigh it. Yes, this is imperfect and flawed. My second and last example is regional distribution. Probably the strongest and most consistent concern is the focus of the early OTP on situations in Africa, reaching a staggering 9 out of 10 situations in one region at one point. That balance has improved. I think that 6 of the latest 7 were out of Africa, so it's fixing the balance. So a lot of people said, well, the OTP, you must be twisting the selection rules. And then the OTP response was, no, we're applying our rules, jurisdiction, where are the ratifications, gravity, complementarity, that keeps taking us to these situations. I'm not going to go into that debate. I want to just add one new, potentially helpful idea. One of the arguments from the early OTP was equitable geographic distribution is not a factor in Article 53. But I think that regional diversity arguably is an appropriate juridical consideration that we should overtly acknowledge and embrace. And it could be either as a factor in prosecutorial discretion and prioritization, or maybe it's part of the interest of justice. If, in reading the interest of justice, we look at the preamble talks about guaranteeing lasting respect for international justice. I think maybe we should openly acknowledge that considering the expressive effects of the court is one of our aims. So that's it. So just to wrap up or summarize, my big appeal here is to move away from a series of one-dimensional analyses and start together doing multi-dimensional analysis. And that means we overtly recognize, one, we have opposing legitimate values and expectations. Two, every possible approach has problems. So 3, our conversation is about what problems are we going to have. And once we see that we're not arguing about right and wrong, we're arguing about the trade-offs between irreconcilable demands, then we realize it's kind of nebulous. And hopefully then our conversation would get more understanding, we'd give more latitude for good faith assessments, and there'd be maybe less condemnation. Thank you.
Thank you, Daryl, for problematizing the problem. I see many questions for you on the horizon. Our next speaker is Ms. Priya Gopalan. She is a Malaysian lawyer specializing in international criminal law, human rights, and gender. She has vast experience in the field of transitional justice and accountability, and this includes working in the Balkans, Ukraine, Sri Lanka, Syria, and the Gambia. She was a prosecutor and appeals counsel at the ICTY, where she played a leading role in cases that set progressive legal precedents for conflict-related sexual violence. And since last year, she's the Asia-Pacific member in the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. Very nice to see you, Priya. You have the floor.
Thank you, Angela. Greetings to all. My remarks today will address intersectional approaches to investigating and prosecuting sexual and gender-based crimes. In doing so, I will focus on 2 areas. First, what is intersectionality? And second, why does intersectionality matter? Now, what is intersectionality? The concept of intersectionality was developed in 1989 by African-American legal scholar Kimberlé Crenshaw to provide a multi-dimensional framework for discrimination law in the United States, a framework that recognizes and accounts for the discrimination experienced by Black women on the basis of their race, sex, and class. In Crenshaw's words, intersectionality is a lens through which power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. Now, when it comes to international criminal law, intersectionality serves as an analytical framework that enables the surfacing of intersecting identities, systems of privilege, for example, patriarchy or colonialism, that drive and form the backdrop of international crimes. Now, how do we link intersectionality to sexual and gender-based crimes? The ICC policy paper on sexual and gender-based crimes recognizes that multiple factors of discrimination may underlie sexual and gender-based crimes, and that these crimes may be motivated by underlying inequalities, as well as a multiplicity of other factors. For example, religious, political, ethnic, national, or economic reasons. The policy as such highlights intersecting structural and systemic inequalities within a particular context, which is the bedrock of an intersectional framework. While the concept is still finding its feet in international criminal law, intersectional analysis is a well-established tool, a well-established analytical tool in the human rights world. For example, decisions of the CEDAW committee regularly address the intersectional approaches of women's human rights violations. Recent reports of the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health and the Independent Expert on Protection Against Violence and Discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender have also made explicit an intersectional approach in their work. Now, pivoting back to international criminal law, an intersectional approach is embedded in Article 21.3 of the Rome Statute. This article requires that the application and interpretation of the law must be consistent with human rights law and without any adverse distinction founded on grounds such as gender and various other grounds as well. Therefore, Article 21.3 not only builds a bridge between international criminal law and international human rights law, in which, as we saw, intersectionality finds deeper roots, it also links an intersectional analysis to how the law is to be applied and interpreted. Despite these snippets of intersectionality highlighted and some promising developments in the jurisprudence, the overriding approach in international criminal law has been to focus on one form of discrimination, for example, gender-based discrimination. Gender analysis, as we know, has achieved much through surfacing the underlying unequal power structures that are embedded in patriarchal systems that drive violence against women. That said, gender, while a significant aspect of a person's identity, is not the only defining aspect of an individual, and gender analysis alone is insufficient to surface the full breadth and depth of harms experienced by survivors. For this, we need to recognize and account for factors beyond gender. Let's turn to some practical examples that demonstrate why intersectionality matters when it comes to crimes of sexual and gender-based violence. A seminal case of conflict-related sexual violence, the sexual enslavement of women and girls by the Japanese military during the Second World War. Estimates indicate that up to 200,000 women and girls were captured, forced, or tricked into sexual slavery. These women were drawn from various colonies of the Japanese at that time, including Korea. We know that sexual slavery is a sexual and gender-based crime. What can intersectionality add here? Pyongyap Min writes that in the case of women and girls from Korea, Japan's colonization of Korea was a critical factor in their sexual enslavement. A state-supported patriarchal system in Japan facilitated the establishment of military brothels, while patriarchal customs in Korea perpetuated further victimization upon their return home. Being drawn largely from impoverished families, Korean survivors were sexually enslaved due to their economic and social status. This meant that when eventually freed from slavery, their future prospects were limited, forcing some to work as sex workers for economic survival. Here we see how an intersectional approach allows us to broaden our vision, to unpack the various diverse drivers of the violations experienced. For these Korean women and girls, gender, along with colonialism, ageism, patriarchy, and class, coalesce to produce their unique violations that for some continue to permeate their lives well beyond the specific acts of their sexual enslavement. Let's take another example. The systematic killing of 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and the removal of Bosnian women, children, and elderly from the Srebrenica enclave in July 1995. We are close to the 27th year of the remembrance of this tragedy. Expert testimony at the Kirsch case in the ICTY, just across the road, identified the Srebrenica syndrome as a specific impediment to female survivors' recovery. One of the primary factors for this, with a few exceptions, was that the majority of the men of Srebrenica were listed as missing, their fate unknown. As a Bosnian Muslim woman, having a clear marital status was paramount. A woman whose husband was missing lacked this status. On a psychological level, the women's recovery was impeded without knowing with certainty the fate of their men and to be able to bury and grieve for them. An intersectional approach reveals that this syndrome was a specific response to the lived experiences of the women, the social and cultural context, such as their religion as Bosnian Muslims and their stature in a patriarchal society where marital status mattered immensely. The individual harms of these women were also woven into the fabric of inter-community and intergenerational harms. Referring to her own family in the words of one former Srebrenica resident, with the fall of Srebrenica, from the face of the earth were wiped off 3 generations of men in the cruelest way possible. As the trial chamber found, most families were dismembered and irreparably rent. A final example relates to conflict-related sexual violence in Sri Lanka, experienced by ethnic Tamil men and boys, perpetrated by Sinhalese state actors. Many survivors articulated feelings of shame and emasculation associated with sexual violence as a gendered harm. Many also felt degraded by the use of abusive language, ethnic slurs, for example, by the perpetrators that underscored their perpetrators' belief and sense of superiority. Here, gender intersected with nationalist narratives on the dominance of the Sinhalese ruling class, the cultural and ethnic hierarchies that fed this dominance and fueled sexual violence, juxtaposed against the minority status of being Tamil in Sri Lanka. Let's wrap up. In the examples discussed, we see how factors such as gender, class, social and economic status, age, culture, religion, and colonial status intersected to compound and hone past violations at an individual and community level, while straddling the present and the future. This is why intersectionality matters. It seeks to uncover violations with an understanding of the past, as well as the present and future realities of survivors, as multi-dimensional complex human beings that we all are. Thus, intersectionality can make visible other pertinent factors and structural inequalities alongside gender that are often disregarded or overlooked. A single-axis analysis would not have done justice to survivors' experiences in this way. That is what intersectionality can bring to the table when properly executed. Critically, it calls for intentionality in seeking to make visible what is excluded and unseen at first glance. Intersectional analysis has the power to set us on a trajectory towards more survivor-responsive processes and outcomes. The very aim that has brought us all together here today. I will leave my remarks at that. Finally, I would like to thank fellow participants in the webinar series on intersectionality and international criminal law, organized by the Emergent Justice Collective, for their insights that have informed my remarks today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priya. Our final speaker for this panel is Professor Olympia Beku, who is the head of law at the University of Nottingham, where she leads the International Criminal Justice Unit of the Nottingham Human Rights Centre. Apart from her widely published academic work, she has undertaken capacity building missions to post-conflict countries on many continents and provided legislation drafting assistance to governments. She is responsible for the National Implementing Legislation Database of the ICC Legal Tools Project, and she serves in many other capacities that are also too numerous to mention here, so I will keep it short. Olympia, thank you for being here, and just a gentle reminder from our interpreters to speak slowly so we can get everything. Thank you, Olympia.
Thank you. I feel I fall within gender lines of using the podium. Your Excellencies, colleagues and friends, it is a great honor to participate in this conference, which marks the 20th anniversary of the entry into force of the Rome Statute. Since becoming operational on the 1st of July 2002, the ICC has occupied a central role in the fight against impunity. However, in recent years, the court has faced significant political attacks, and its operation has been the subject of increased scrutiny. We've heard already from Daryl that whatever the court does, it will be under attack. The anniversary provides an important opportunity to reflect on whether the Rome system's promise to deliver justice has materialized. We also have an opportune moment to look to the future and ensure the continued relevance of the court. It is a timely moment, as allegations of serious international crimes committed in Ukraine are testing the ability of international law. Since the start of the conflict, the eyes of the world have turned to The Hague. Despite the sudden expansion of its workload, the ICC must fulfill its mandate, not only with respect to Ukraine, but in every situation under its jurisdiction. Your Excellencies, the Rome Statute system is built upon two fundamental pillars: complementarity and cooperation. And I will take each of those in turn. The ICC is not intended to replace or displace national courts. It operates as a court of last resort. The primary responsibility to investigate and prosecute core international crimes rests with states. The ICC only intervenes when states are genuinely unwilling or unable to do so. To this end, the principle of complementarity is designed to ensure that cases are heard before the appropriate mechanism, be it the ICC or a national court. Complementarity, therefore, both respects sovereignty and harnesses the advantages of trials before national courts. For example, easier access to evidence and witnesses arising from their proximity to the location of the crimes. In doing this, complementarity also works to allocate finite resources effectively. The ICC cannot process each and every case that arises from the commission of mass atrocity. Even where the ICC were to step in and take over proceedings, states retain a very significant role. For example, the court does not have its own police force to collect evidence or arrest and surrender individuals. It is therefore reliant upon the cooperation of national authorities to carry out its functions. States are expected to be at the forefront of the fight against impunity. Enacting national legislation to fully and effectively implement the provisions of the Rome Statute is key. Your Excellencies, such implementation fulfills a dual purpose. Crucially, it enables states to exercise primary jurisdiction over core international crimes, and it facilitates state compliance with cooperation requests made by the court. Whilst the Rome Statute does not expressly require the incorporation of the core crimes and procedures within national legislation, doing so, it is indispensable to meet the duty of every state to exercise its criminal jurisdiction over those responsible for international crimes, which is enshrined in the preamble of the Rome Statute. Implementing legislation is therefore a precursor to national criminal justice systems being able to investigate and prosecute core international crimes. It thus ensures the primacy of domestic proceedings. Conversely, the absence of implementing legislation has the potential to undermine the promise of complementarity and the effective functioning of the ICC system. Implementing legislation is also indispensable in discharging a state's cooperation obligations. Notably, Article 88 of the statute requires states to ensure that there are procedures available under their national laws for all forms of cooperation. The Rome Statute's entry into force provided a catalyst which triggered a wave of national implementation. Numerous states increased their efforts to fight impunity. Complementarity functioned as a strong incentive for implementation and acted as a jurisdictional safety pin, empowering states to investigate and prosecute core international crimes within the court's jurisdiction and keeping it at bay. However, 20 years later, as we gather for this anniversary, only a little over half of the state parties, nearly 70, have at least partially adopted domestic implementing legislation for the crimes. And less than half of the state parties, approximately 55, have legislation enabling cooperation with the court. Implementation continues to be far from uniform. States are afforded wide discretion for implementation. Several states have replicated the exact wording of the statute. This approach ensures clarity, predictability, and compliance with the principle of legality. Moreover, while some states have adopted more restrictive definitions, leaving possible gaps, others have employed broader definitions, criminalizing wider conducts. Alongside incorporating the definition of the crimes, the ability of states to effectively investigate and prosecute core international crimes depends on the jurisdictional reach they envisage. Exercising jurisdiction based on territoriality and nationality is common. An approach that includes universal jurisdiction can also help reduce the impunity gap, enabling states with interest and resources to step in. Moreover, whilst the principle of complementarity does not dictate how cases are to be tried before domestic courts, nor does it expect an ICC-style trial at the domestic level, state parties ought to give due consideration to the general principles found in the statute. Your Excellencies, no trial can succeed without arresting the accused and providing evidence to prove their guilt or innocence. Domestic provisions must be in place to arrest and surrender individuals at the request of the court, to collect evidence, hand over documents, and facilitate the appearance of experts and witnesses. In addition, ratifying the Agreement on Privileges and Immunities and signing bilateral or multilateral agreements on mutual legal assistance, extradition and judicial cooperation are also important. Encouraging states to do so ought to be a priority. However, the availability of a domestic framework implementing the full gamut of the Rome Statute does not on its own ensure greater accountability, nor does it guarantee compliance with ICC cooperation requests. A lot rests on political will. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all state parties must rise to the implementation challenge. Let us not underestimate the challenges. Alongside the need for political will, drafting and enacting implementing legislation is a complex and time-consuming process. Not all states, particularly post-conflict or transitioning states, have the necessary resources and expertise. There may also be inherent difficulties within domestic legal systems. For instance, constitutional provisions or pre-existing national laws which need to be reviewed, such as statutes of limitations and immunities. It is then necessary to remove obstacles and provide assistance to those states that require it. Over the past 20 years, the concept of positive complementarity has been developed to help build national capacity and increase the ability of states to conduct genuine investigations and prosecutions. In addition, a positive approach to complementarity adopted by the Office of the Prosecutor, exemplified by the Colombia and Venezuela cooperation agreements, is a step in the right direction. Your Excellencies, the Assembly of States Parties has a key role in facilitating discussions between states to accelerate the pace of national implementation processes. States can draw upon and find inspiration in examples of implementing laws enacted by others. There is existing support in that respect in the ICC's Legal Tools project, which contains freely available databases on implementing legislation and cooperation, which I've had the privilege of curating for the past 15 years. As we meet to mark the 20th anniversary and look to the future, it is clear that the ICC remains at the center of the system of accountability for core international crimes. Pursuant to the principle of complementarity, the Rome Statute system encourages genuine and fair justice efforts, closer to where the crimes have taken place. And the longevity of the ICC rests greatly on the success of the complementarity regime. States must adopt implementing legislation as a first step towards being willing and able to investigate and prosecute. The success of the Rome Statute system is also influenced by the ability and willingness of states to cooperate fully with the ICC. Implementing legislation provides the legal basis for giving full effect to cooperation requests. As with complementarity, the ability of states to cooperate with the court is inextricably linked with domestic implementation of the statute's provisions. However, political support is also needed. When political support for the court is high, so too is cooperation. When a state withdraws political support, cooperation levels fall. Non-cooperation remains a significant challenge. Your Excellencies, colleagues and friends, 20 years after the entry into force of the Rome Statute, we have come a long way in supporting the court to fulfill its mandate. This is not the end of the road, however. I would urge those states that have not yet implemented the statute to take that important step and to do so fully. Only then can the promise of complementarity be materialized. Only then can cooperation be supported. Only then can the future of the ICC be guaranteed. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Olympia. It is my pleasure to open the floor. We have a microphone that someone will bring to you. There's a very big team helping us today. Thank you. I see the lady in front of me as the first speaker. Just a reminder, please speak slowly for the purposes of interpretation and keep your questions or comments short, please. Thank you.
Hello?
Go ahead, please. Then we'll have. Yeah. Please go ahead, Judge.
Okay. Bonjour tout le monde.
Good morning, everyone. I greet Judge Kirsch, and I pay tribute to his ongoing commitment to international justice. Regarding the French-speaking states, the various institutions of civil society have organized a number of workshops which I have taken part in. The ICC has done great work, but much remains to be done. Many French-speaking countries follow the civil law tradition, something they inherited from the colonizing powers. Now, in the French system, there are investigating magistrates who investigate suspects and anyone else who may emerge during the investigation. If that principle was established within the ICC, would perpetrators such as Jean-Pierre Bemba have been able to leave without exactly determining who perpetrated the crimes in the Central African Republic? It is difficult to, well, you see, the victims are real. The victims still are living with the stigma. Yes, Jean-Pierre Bemba was not actually on site, but he had his commanders. Under his command, if he and his commanders are not responsible for the crimes that occurred, who was? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take 3 questions for this round. Yes, we have, sorry, the lady in the white jacket, and then we have the lady on the end, please. Thank you. I see you.
Good afternoon. Alexandra Drik, Center for Civil Liberties, Ukraine. Thank you, the distinguished panelists, for very valuable speeches. My question will be addressed to Mr. Hahn as the leading prosecutor on investigation on Ukraine. And it will consist on 3 parts. First, with the well, first of all, thank you for this, for initiating this investigation supported by 41 countries parties to the Rome Statute. I hope you understand that you have raised the hopes of some 40 million of Ukrainians, many of which for justice, many of which have become already victims of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, and the number of these victims is rising as we speak. So my question is, first, with the around 40 analysts, prosecutors, and forensic experts working on the ground in Ukraine, have you already started to collect the evidence? Second is the information that you currently have can form the basis for the genocide investigation, given the fact that many of the war crimes that are being committed by the Russian army in Ukraine directly are a part of the Genocide Convention. And third, if you support the, given that the crimes of aggression, the ICC does not have the jurisdiction over the crimes of aggression, in this particular case, do you support the idea of the independent international tribunal for Ukraine to use the crime of aggression against Russia in this way? Thank you. Bonjour.
Good morning, Elisabeth Rabisana. I am one of the legal representatives of victims at the ICC. I'm an external counsel. I am currently working on the Ekatarina Trendafilova case from the CAR. I am the spokesperson for external counsel who so far have not had the role that they should have within the court. It is very difficult for LRVs to find their place within a trial. We are the direct voice of the victims. I am working also in the Chad. I have gone to the camps in Chad. For years I have been going to these camps because I worked on the Discrimination case earlier. The court has not been able to go to some of these places. We LRVs are the ambassadors of the court in many ways, and the refugees in the camps want to be part of the trials. They want to participate. We practice Romano-Germanic law. We know what it is to be a victim in legal proceedings. We do not have equality of arms. We are not the prosecution. We are not the defense, but practicing as independent external counsel, we have gained the trust of these communities. We have heard their observations. These areas are their areas. There is a tremendous amount of collective intelligence within the camps. And I was happy to hear the remarks from the prosecutor. There are many resources that we, external counsel, are familiar with. So what I would like today is to make two requests. In the next decade, I do hope that the court will have the political will to provide a place for us so that we are properly welcomed, not treated like a disappearing species. We cannot sell our souls, and this contribution that we make cannot be replaced. The court must consider the legal representatives of victims, and together we must be able to work more and work better for the victims who are still waiting 10, 15, 20 years after the events. They want to understand. We have heard the comments making regarding the victims in the Bemba case who are still waiting for justice. Reparations come later, and the court must not treat the victims as, how should I put this, as rarities to be displayed in a display case. I do hope that in the next decade we will have the proper place that we deserve within the court and the system.
Because we've had a comment as well, so the gentleman in that row, yes, thank you. And again, a reminder, please be brief so we can take as many questions and comments as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. It's amazing to be here for the 20 years of the ICC in a room full of people. I've debated, argued, and practiced international justice for 20 years, and it's only fitting that on this panel there are a few of those people. Daryl, Judge Trendafilova, it's always a pleasure. And to celebrate the 20 years, I have a brief question for you. Two short questions. The first one is on the notion of constructive ambiguity, which is a notion that has its appeal, but I've always found it's a double-edged sword, especially from the defense perspective and the protection of the rights, because for me, the idea of constructive ambiguity is another way to not respect the principle of legality. It's quite the opposite of the principle of legality. There is no constructive ambiguity because doubt benefits the accused, and the legal text must be extremely clear. So I don't know if you wanted to had any comments on this aspect. And the second point, also from a defense perspective, is this question of charging. Also from a, this is to protect the rights of the defense. It's to protect the accused right to be notified of the charges. And so I wondered if I could have your view, if you want to share it, or others on the panel, on this idea that the more flexibility we allow the prosecution in terms of cumulative charging, in terms of adding as many modes of liability, the less there is actual notification. Because if the prosecutor is allowed to put, pardon the kind of basic expression, everything in the kitchen sink in the charging document, then there's no notification. If the prosecution is allowed to put 6 modes of liability, that's not real notification, because you're just telling the accused, read the Rome Statute, you can be charged, you can be prosecuted for any one of those modes of liability. So I don't know if you had any additional thoughts on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll allow the panelists an opportunity to respond. Prosecutor, I think we'll start with you, if you're okay with that. You had several questions. Thank you.
Do you want me to try and address each of them? Because, okay. First question, really nothing really to say. In terms of the respective merits of different systems, that discussion has been had ad nauseum with respect at Rome and since. We have the system we have, and I respect decisions of the judges. I think that's the only way an officer of the court can behave, is to respect appellate decisions and decisions of the court. In relation to the issue of Elizabeth and the issues you raise, I think it's a tremendous achievement, the role that's been given to victims. I think it's hyperbole, quite frankly, to say that anybody's being asked to sell their souls. There is a legal aid system, there's representation, there's OPCV. I've represented victims in different situations, and I think the registry also should be given very significant credit. I know you've been in camps, but just 2 days ago, the registrar brought over a whole host of people from Darfur, from camps, to bring them closer to the court. So nothing's perfect, as Professor Daryl said, but we are trying to move better and do more. In relation to, I think, Dove Jacobs, I think really that's for the judge, but the only point I would say regarding constructive ambiguity, there must surely be a difference between constructive ambiguity, which of course cannot be tolerated in relation to the actus reus and mens rea of substantive offences, and in relation to the procedural framework of the court that must be, judges have and must be allowed to render practical and effective rather than theoretical and illusionary. In relation to the question from the Centre for Civil Liabilities, please really be, I think, in all situations, victims everywhere have massive hopes. I think we need to have a dose of realism that crime is deep, the wounds are real and raw in many situations. International criminal justice does not repair the loss of life. It doesn't bring the dead back to life. It doesn't repair. It's an important part. All we can do as the ICC, all actors, judges, prosecutor, registry, defense, victims, is to do our best. But we also have to realize what the expectations are regarding international criminal law. In terms of this issue of genocide, it's very wrong, and these are frequent questions I get from Ukraine, but other situations. It's as wrong to start with targets. You must follow the evidence and see where it leads, if anywhere. And in terms of the classification of offences, you don't start with the Article 5 crimes, you start with the evidence, see what emerges, and then put it against the framework of the court and decide what, if any, charges have been committed, whether it's genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, or in other situations regarding aggression. Of course, the Kampala Amendment has been activated. The court does have jurisdiction. It simply hasn't been triggered in that particular situation. I will focus on my responsibility, which is the law we've got. I think we need to be alert not to have equally impotent institutions mushrooming left and right. But states must decide. They pay for these institutions that they create, and it's a matter for them. But I've got my views, and I think that's enough at the moment on that.
Thank you. Judge Trendafilova, please.
There are a number of very interesting questions, starting with the question that was raised by my dearest friend, Judge Fatoumata Diarra, and I can understand very well her question, because herself, myself, and it was also Judge Tarfurser, who is not right now here, Judge Hans-Peter Kaul, we have been sitting at the pretrial stage of the proceedings on the Bemba case. I wouldn't like to go into, first of all, let me make it very clear. When I had some exchanges with colleagues, including with some of our dear colleagues who finally took this decision, the majority, I always make the point, we have to be respectful about a final decision with regard to its enforcement. However, when it comes to how lawyers analyze the decision, the reasoning, the approach that is taken with regard to some major issues like standard of proof, like commence responsibility and so on, I preserve my total independence to speak out my mind. What I will not do now, because we don't have the time and I find it inappropriate during this event. But I have to say, and I will finish with this, here is Mr. Ocampo. This at the time was one of your best cases at the pretrial stage of the proceedings. Thereafter, of course, it is for the judges who are sitting on the trial panel to speak about this, the strength of the case, and thereafter, of course, the judges, but you know there was 3-2. This raises some issues, and of course, to be further on developed by the colleagues that are currently sitting on the bench of the ICC and for the future generations. About the constructive ambiguity. That's why I was referring to Lord Denning's view, because I personally have been involved quite a lot in drafting criminal justice legislation or legislation related thereto. And based on my experience, I know that it is not possible to provide, as he says, divine precision and to be able to predict anything that real life is going to bring to the bench of the judges. But you're absolutely right, this couldn't be to the detriment to those who are suspect, accused, and so on. And here, the proper approach is that we are guided by the solid fundamental principles in the field when we resort to constructive ambiguity. I remember in my first year at the IC, although I knew the Rome Statute and the rules of procedure and evidence, but I didn't detect the presumption of innocence, like also in a title. My reading, I didn't have a recollection. I was telling one of my colleagues, legal officer, I always address them as colleagues, but I cannot find this provision. And he was telling me, well, there is no. I said, that is impossible not to have a provision specifically dealing with the presumption of innocence. And thereafter, of course, making my own review in Article, I think, 66, paragraph 2, of course. So these are the basic principles that have to guide us. With regard to this, a number of different modes of liability that the pretrial chamber comes up with, I have to say that the initial approach of pretrial chambers was not that. We were very, very firmly providing just one mode of liability of mens rea. However, thereafter, having considered a number of elements, first of all, that the pretrial stage doesn't deal with a lot of evidence, that there could be additional evidence and much more evidence presented during the central stage of the proceedings, the trial stage. Also, bearing in mind that judges, colleagues who come from the common law system had some difficulties even resorting to the regulation, I think it's 55, reconsideration of the legal characterization, even not at all related to changing on the basis of facts the whole of the approach of the trial panel to the mens rea. That's why we decided that, of course, there are pros and cons, as you rightly said, to come up, and that is what we did, I think, in Taganda, one of the last cases that I was busy with. We provided different modes of liability, By this, of course, we put the defense in a good position, but also with some negative consequences, because it has the time to prepare for the trial, but at the same time, it takes a lot of time and delays the proceedings. So it's a little bit more complicated. It would have been better, and I finish on this, if the drafters would have provided a possibility based on the evidence that parties will present, that they're going to dispute about, to have a provision making it possible even to come up with new charges. And of course, providing all the opportunities to the defense to prepare.
Thank you, Priya. Thank you. Just like to offer some thoughts on Judge Fatuma Diarra's comment and a question on the Bemba case. I was struck by her question in particular. If Bemba does not have responsibility, who does? As we know in this case, there were two grounds under which the appeal was overturned. And the second ground in particular is the one that relates to sexual and gender-based crimes, in addition to other crimes such as murder and pillage. And we know there that the issue was whether Bemba had taken all necessary and reasonable measures within his power to prevent or repress the crimes. And it was found that he didn't. The point I'm making is a larger one that relates to sexual and gender-based violence, sexual and gender-based crimes, and the common challenge that is faced in prosecuting these crimes, one of which is the difficulty of establishing linkage between the underlying acts and those most responsible, those in power. Of course, there are the legal concepts at work available to do so, whether that's command responsibility or common purpose, but the fact remains that this is a persistent challenge, the issue of linkage, whether it relates to crimes of sexual violence or other crimes as well. And the second issue is related to the issue of linkage and specific to crimes of sexual violence is whether these crimes are accorded or required to accede to a higher standard of proof. Now, Angela, in her opening remarks, highlighted that there have been challenges in prosecuting these crimes at the court, and these are the two issues, or some of the issues that I can highlight here. But having said that, despite raising these challenges of linkage and possibly double standards when it comes to evidentiary issues in terms of proving crimes of sexual violence, I would like to end by noting that the process of achieving accountability for these sort of crimes, as we see from a historical perspective, is that it has been an organic process and one of incremental gain. So although Bemba, its outcome has been highlighted here, leaves us with many questions, I think we can also note that it was significant because in that case, sexual violence against men was charged as rape. It was the first case in which male victims provided testimony in support of charges of rape. So when I talk about incremental wins and an organic process, this is what I mean. There are developments even in the missed opportunities. And in a field like sexual and gender-based crimes, where the challenges in terms of investigating and prosecuting are particularly fraught, these wins are ones that I think are worth remembering. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Priya. I know Judge Osuji has a question, and then I'd like to take one question from this side and one question from that side to be fair. So, Judge, please go ahead, and then we'll see who else has questions. Thank you.
Can we have technicians turn on the roving microphone, please?
Well, thank you very much. Speaking now, we're not talking about Bamba, but it's good to be here. And when I heard the prosecutor use a certain phrase, infusion of money, that felt good, I must tell you, because in the 9 years I was at the court, the struggle was whether it was going to be zero nominal growth or not. But it's good to see that there is infusion of money. Now, the question is really to Professor Robinson from there. What is the range of that goodwill that that expression signifies? Infusion of money. I'm here speaking specifically in terms of what led to this infusion of money. There was a crime of aggression, an apparent one, committed. And we saw an impetus to do something about it. We heard the former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown leading an effort to establish a special tribunal for the crime of aggression in Ukraine, because the Rome Statute contains a gap in that regard. Are we going to leave that gap there after this infusion of money and the goodwill that generated it? Is this the time now to go back and look at Article 15, Base 5, that says that the Rome Statute has no jurisdiction over a national or territory of a state, non-state party, except if the Security Council refers it? Is it time to close that gap? Is it time also to look at Article 15, 13b, that says the Security Council, within the UN constellation, only the Security Council under Article Chapter 7 can refer a case to the prosecutor? Is it time now to look at that and see the possibility of the UN General Assembly being able to do something where the Security Council fails to do that, so we don't have that gap, so we don't have the struggle to refer the situation in Syria to the prosecutor? Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. As I said, one question from this side, please, one question from that side, if there are any, out of fairness. Okay, then anybody in the middle who has a burning question? Yes, I see two questions. This lady, yes, and then two of you here. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for everyone's very remarkable intervention so far. My question is one for the prosecutor. Picking up on what you just said about that dose of realism. Oh yeah, by the way, my name is Shalene Chin, and I'm here on behalf of civil society, representing the Institute for Environmental Security, Stop Ecocide Foundation, and I also work very closely with small island developing states. Now, again, back to my question, this is one for the prosecutor. That dose of realism, now, how can the court go about reconciling what Professor Robinson and also Priya said about the intersectional approach and also multi-dimensional analysis when it comes to victims and 21st century crimes and a call for justice? So if you imagine Article 15 submissions, communications that are submitted to the court, that dose of realism, how does one then take the perspectives also of civil society and also go about, justifying whether or not the court can go ahead with these types of crimes, for instance, that are submitted by civil society? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could the two people raise their hands again just so you can get, yes. Do you see them? They're over here.
Hello everyone, my name is Marina Bardina. I am a member of Ukrainian Parliament. First of all, our congratulations on 20th anniversary of Rome Statute. You know, we just did numerous steps towards the process of ratification, and I hope that one day our Ukrainian flag will be in the building of the ICC. I want to thank you, Mr. Khan, for your work, and we met with your team and just ready to do all legislative work needed for to better the synergy between Ukraine and the ICC. My question is about sexual violence. You know, I just in Parliament organizing work around this issue, investigation commission, legislative work to motivate the victims and witnesses of sexual violences committed by Russian soldiers, to motivate them to come to law enforcement and talk about this. But it's too difficult, and maybe it's just crime committed by Russians, which the more difficult to document evidence. Maybe you have any comments, any recommendations where to go and how motivate victims talk about everything happened with them. Thank you.
Sorry, I believe the gentleman next to you had a question. Thank you. And that will be the last question for today, I'm afraid.
Thank you. My name is Denis Maslov. I'm also a member of Parliament of Ukraine, and I support my colleague. I want to tell thank you and my congratulations with 20th anniversary of ICC. And of course, my question will be about Ukraine. Your Excellency, Mr. Khan, as you know, on June 27, just a few days ago, Russian Federation launched another missile attack on a civilian object on the territory of Ukraine. A missile attack was launched on shopping center in the city Kremenchuk, Poltava region. More than 20 people were killed. In this missile strike, dozens were injured, dozens are considered missing as the mall building burned down and collapsed. This night, the Russian Federation launched rocket attacks on a residential building in Odessa region. As of now, 19 people have died, 2 of whom are children, and dozens of people have been injured. Mr. Prosecutor, my questions are following. Do you intend to take over the investigation of these cases? And have you discussed the possibility of such investigation with the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Mrs. Irina Venediktova? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll give my panelists an opportunity to answer and give their final word, but would also ask them to be brief. We're encroaching on lunch, so please, I will start with you, Prosecutor, and then we'll move on to everybody else. Yeah.
I'll go first, but I know my other panelists haven't had a chance to speak, but very quickly in that case, if I may. In terms of the question addressed to me, the first question addressed to me, it really was a necessary response to the comment about raising hopes. And I think it shouldn't be lost on anybody. There are some conflicts that are so deep, so intractable, whether it's Palestine, Israel, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Myanmar with Rohingyas. I mean, most of these situations that with military measures, with economic, with political, with diplomatic, peace hasn't been achieved. So the expectation that justice by itself is going to fulfill all the hopes needs to be moderated by our experience and our intellect and the understanding that even these other very powerful instruments sometimes can't bring about the change that's necessary. In terms of the intersectional approach, and well, really, it's not perhaps in this context an intersectional approach. In terms of civil society, we're doing it in many ways. You know, on missions, the Deputy Prosecutor just came back from Libya, meeting Libyan communities. The court as a whole is trying, as I mentioned, Sudan is the most recent example, trying to have outreach. We had a few weeks back with the President, with the Registrar, the annual event with civil society, with the wonderful work of the coalition of the ICC. I've also launched a new initiative of 2 thematic roundtables a year. On the 14th of July, we'll be launching, along with Eurojust, the Office of the Prosecutor with Eurojust, 2 guides, one addressed to states and one to NGOs about documentation. So, and I mentioned, or maybe I missed it in terms of technology, all of these ways are ways of trying to bring everybody to the table and realization we can't discharge responsibility unless we build these partnerships, and civil society, victim group, states, all actors are important in relation to that. So I think that's also the question in relation to Ukraine. Of course, all sides have clear responsibilities, and in terms of sexual and gender-based crimes and crimes against and affecting children, I've repeatedly stated it's a massive priority. We have appointed just in the last few days a new head of our Gender and Children's Unit in Diane Looping. We also have wonderful special advisors, and we're looking forward, and we've launched a consultation on a new policy paper on gender persecution. So these are initiatives, but really we need to take, I keep saying this, take the law, take the policies off the paper and start implement it in practice, and that requires help from everybody. In terms of Dennis, your question regarding particular instances, we know what the Rome Statute crimes are. They're there for everybody to read. I think you've got a wonderful Prosecutor General in Irina Vendikatova. She's just been to that shopping mall. We're in regular contact with her, and we have to follow the evidence. And of course, we respect the statute, which is based upon complementarity. Thank you.
Thank you. Olympia, and then Daryl, please.
Okay, thank you. I would like to share a few thoughts on the proposed tribunal on aggression, if I may. I think, although the moral argument is definitely there, I would err on the side of caution for the creation of such a tribunal. And there are a number of reasons for this view that I'm expressing here today. First of all, let us be frank, the pool of resources is finite. Any creation of another tribunal will proliferate and perhaps fragment the efforts, and perhaps it can take away resources that are currently given to the ICC. Similarly, ad hoc tribunals come with concerns of selectivity, and I know, okay, we had Nuremberg, we had Tokyo, but now we're in a different world with a permanent court. We would still have concerns over arresting the possible accused. Trials, if we do it trials in absentia, that will be a different issue. We would have concerns there. If we don't do trials in absentia, then you'll have the same restrictions in arresting and surrendering people to that ad hoc tribunal. And there's also, for me, there's the other issue. We have states that have not signed up to the Aggression Amendment. They have not implemented the Aggression Amendment. How would we feel if those states were at the forefront of an ad hoc tribunal? So I guess my view, although I appreciate the moral argument for the crime of aggression, my view is to support the ICC in doing the work that it can do on Ukraine, rather than fragment the system further by creating an ad hoc tribunal. But I may not be in the majority on this one.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I think Chili's question correctly points to another one of these paradoxes I've talked about. This one is a paradox between the mandate and the budget, the mandate being limitless and the budget being finite, and that creates another one of these problems where whatever the court does will breach something. As for the crime of aggression and closing the gap, I agree. The jurisdictional provision is very complicated, and I think Article 12 is an elegant bit of drafting, it has two simple, it's either territory or nationality, and that simple provision is actually very difficult to explain to an often skeptical public, whereas the jurisdictional provision, it's not just convoluted, it has ambiguities in it that experts argue about. So regrettably, I think it's one more time bomb that has been handed over to the ICC. When the time comes to interpret it, they will be castigated regardless of how they do it. But unfortunately, as for a solution, I don't see a short-term or immediate-term solution. I think states are not enthused to further amend the statute at the moment, so it might be a long-term problem, a solution.
Thank you, Daryl. I'll have Priya and then Judge Trendafilova, please. Thank you.
Just a few comments or thoughts on the question about sexual violence in Ukraine and how to, I think the word that was used was to motivate survivors to talk, and that it has been a difficult process. The first thought I have is it relates to the timing of when individuals of traumatic crimes feel ready, psychologically able to speak. There's been a lot of work done in relation to when such individuals are able to answer questions, to give testimony on what has happened to them, because time is needed to process the trauma, and when the trauma is fresh, there are obviously challenges in play in terms of being able to share that information. And related to that, speaking about trauma, speaking about fresh violations, a significant process or support mechanism that needs to be in place when working with such survivors is psychological support. So if we would like to speak to survivors of sexual violence who have just experienced this crime, what sort of psychological support can we offer? Because inevitably speaking about it, retelling the story results in re-traumatization for many. And therefore, in terms of adopting an approach that respects the victim, that is victim-centered, that has the victim's interest at heart, this would be another consideration. Is the survivor able to get the necessary support, psychological support that he or she would need? So the final point I'd like to make really is a summation of these few points. It's a question of whether the survivor is willing and able to testify or provide information, and what are the conditions that we have created as the investigators in terms of enabling safe disclosure of information. So this would be things like ensuring confidentiality, this would be ensuring that survivors' wishes in terms of who asks the questions, whether it's the gender of the investigator could be significant. So there are lots of practical aspects that arise later on in the process when the interview or the questions are actually asked. And the bedrock or the fundamental principle is that it has to be one based on the survivor's choice, respect for agency, and in a safe environment. But taking a step back well before we get to the stage in terms of the integrity, the psychological integrity of the survivor, there are critical considerations that we have to take into account, which is when is the survivor ready to speak? So I'll leave it at that.
Sorry, because maybe I missed an aspect of the question. Just very briefly, and it'll be elaborated on the documentary release. It's very important into crimes of, well, all crimes, allegations, but particularly sexual and gender-based crimes, perhaps, don't over-document. We've seen the tremendous harm that is caused in places like Cox's Bazar, where there's almost a stampede of documentation in which victims very often become little more than commodities, and their accounts are taken in sometimes parlous and less than optimal conditions, and there's re-traumatization. So really, I think in the consultation paper that we've sent out to NGOs recently regarding the paper, if in doubt, don't go and interview vulnerable witnesses. There are national authorities, there's the Office of the Prosecutor, refer them, but don't just jump in, because the harm can be very real for the victims who we're trying to work to protect and have their cases and their narratives put before judges.
Thank you. Judge Trendafilova.
Well, I will not add anything in addition to what my colleagues already responded to the last three questions, but I tend to agree with Olympia that although now I'm president of a tribunal that is of course, ad hoc nature, but we are working very hard towards fulfilling our mandate within quite a reasonable and not lengthy period of time. But I will take the opportunity, because I was asked to speak on the judicial control. I couldn't touch upon, and I will not develop, but just one of the main concerns throughout my domestic experience at the ICC and now with this new institution is how we deal with evidence. And I tend to even visualize my point that I want to make. If we visualize an institution like a shell, there should be a good cover, strong meaning, a lot of knowledge in substantive law, in humanitarian law, procedural law, to reach the pearl, which is how we handle evidence. And a lot of the problems that not only myself, but a lot of colleagues, the general public encounter when following how anyone who has a different role in the system of criminal justice deals with evidence. This is, in my view, the most important issue on which we have to work a lot, to further on develop education, to further on develop practices, because we might be brilliant in all other fields, but if at the end, having all the evidence on our bench, we are unable to properly deal, and not just here there is a small issue, we throw it away, and so, but a much more sophisticated work is to find a way to see how evidence is interrelated, how it forms a system whereby we could reach the threshold that is required at different stages of the proceedings. And I take the opportunity that you gave me to raise my most serious concern that I have, dealing with evidence properly.
Thank you very much, Judge Trendafilova. And I have to say, I genuinely leave this panel with a sense of optimism, particularly have to align myself with the views expressed about how to handle victims and how to treat their evidence and not to over-document and respect their autonomy is very important. Thank you, Prosecutor, for setting the tone for this conversation and for taking the OTP into the digital future. I think that's really important. And Judge, you laid the foundation for the important cases that have shaped judicial control of investigations and charging. Daryl, you didn't just problematize the problem, but you also told us it's important to have the right conversations and to understand competing expectations. And Priya, such an important topic, something I feel very strongly about. I really think intersectionality should be the foundation for all the work we do in international criminal law. And finally, Olympia, complementarity and cooperation. Having litigated at the domestic level, I have to say the impact of the appropriate legislation has made all the difference. So this is an absolutely crucial topic. I will not stand between you and your lunch, so I will conclude by thanking the President for having this event, and thank you to everyone, and congratulations for coming this far with the International Criminal Court. I look forward to another 20 years, and thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you, Angela, for chairing this panel. Thank you to the panelists, and we have arrived to the moment of the lunch. We have a break of 1 hour. We'll be here at 1:25, more or less. Thank you.